Nick, I studied neuroscience because I really want to understand consciousness, and this has been a great motivation in life. And I, like anybody, have this sense of the unity of consciousness, and I want to understand all the systems and how it works so that I have this sense of unity. And then once in a while, something comes up which shakes my understanding of my own sense of psychic unity. Blindsight, which you have pioneered, is one of them. Help me understand how it works and why it changes our perception of what consciousness is.
Blindsight has a history of hints of blindsight, which we didn't quite understand. Some of my own work I wasn't able really to interpret until the first human subjects came along who have this extraordinary clinical syndrome. The way that the scientists were able to demonstrate the existence of this extraordinary phenomenon was by asking the blind subject, the subject who was blind in a large part of his visual field, to look in the direction of a light on the screen which he said he couldn't see. And the scientist then said to the subject, well, supposing you could see it, can you guess where it would be? And yes, the subject points directly at it. And then they repeated it with colours, for example. There would be a coloured light on the screen. And they'd ask the subject, again, in an area where he said he was quite blind, to guess what colour he would be seeing if he could see it. And yes, red, green, he gets it right. And all the time the subject will say, yes, but there's no sensation there. I'm not conscious of anything. I don't have any reasons for the judgments, the guesses which I'm making. Now that discovery really opened up a whole new way of looking at consciousness. The possibility that consciousness has separate, different channels. And in my own work, as I developed it, I became increasingly interested in the nature of what was missing in the cases of blindsight. Blindsight subjects can apparently take in information about the world, but it doesn't feel like anything. There's nothing there for them. Sensation isn't present. They don't feel involved in it. They don't feel that it's their take on the world. It's just a guess. Now, I came to it through a series of 7 years of studying one particular monkey who lived here in Cambridge to begin with. I was a research student in the psychology lab here, and my supervisor had done an operation to remove the visual cortex at the back of the brain of this monkey. And when I first met her, she seemed to be completely blind, as of course conventional neurophysiology would have said she would be. The visual cortex is gone. How could she possibly see? I spent just a few days to begin with sitting with her, playing with her, and it became obvious to me almost at once that the story was wrong. This monkey was seeing much more than she ought to be able to. And within a few days, I got her reaching out to touch my fingers when I held up a piece of apple, for example. And we began to interact in ways which should have been impossible. Well, from there, her sight began to burgeon. In fact, I worked with that one monkey for the next 7 years. I adopted her as a kind of pet. I moved to another laboratory in the country outside Cambridge where I could take her for walks in the field. And I would walk around the village on a leash. And we would just interact in the presence of objects to the point at which her vision had seemed to have returned to complete normality. She could catch a fly as it passed by. She could run around a room, picking up things, avoiding obstacles. Everything seemed to be completely normal. But I was certain it actually wasn't normal. There was something very strange about her vision. She seemed only to be able to see if she didn't try too hard to see. If she was frightened, for example, she suddenly became completely blind again. And I began to speculate. It was speculation at that point that what was missing was that she really didn't know that she could see. She could only do it when she didn't try too hard. As soon as she thought about, can I see or not, apparently she couldn't. I wrote an article back, I think in 1972, suggesting that this was a new form of vision which lacked conscious sensation, but was nonetheless delivering some kind of visual perception. But it was a guess. Then Larry Weisskranz, a couple of years later, discovered the first human case of blindsight, where the subject could actually be asked what's going on, and that confirmed this extraordinary phenomenon that, yes, indeed, the subject is consciously blind and yet has the capacity to take in and use visual information to form perceptual representations. Now, what's so, of course, so fascinating, at least in the way I went with that, is, well, if you can do that, if you can have unconscious vision, why do you have conscious vision? What's the point of sensations? I think of Blindsight as representing a case, an example of what we might call psychological zombiedom. These are not zombies in the philosophical sense who are completely unconscious, but they're creatures, human beings here, who actually can deliver in terms of cognitive functions without there being any accompanying conscious sensation. Now that presents a real puzzle, an evolutionary puzzle, a puzzle for understanding what the purpose of it is.
When one understands the neuroanatomy, one can make a case that from the eye, for example, the optic nerve goes to a relay station lower in the brain that is not conscious, called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and there to the middle part of the brain, thalamus, or directly to the cortex. So there are different processing centers within the brain that are below the cortical level, which we think is consciousness. So one can build a biological basis to begin to describe the kind of thing that we're talking about.
We can. We didn't know we could at the time, though we might have guessed, because, yes, even higher mammals like ourselves have two visual systems. We have the cortical visual system, which is the more recently developed one, but we still have the old reptilian visual system in the midbrain, the brachia and the visual system, which is all that exists, for, say, for frogs and amphibia. And I wrote a paper about this monkey. She was called Helen, which was called "What the Frog's Eye Tells the Monkey's Brain," arguing that actually, yes, she was using this midbrain ancient system, but the characteristic of it was that it didn't deliver consciousness. It wasn't delivering sensation. And now we know very much more. There's been a tremendous amount of very sophisticated work working to find out exactly what's going on in the case of Blindsight. But the original phenomenon, I think, just blew our minds in some ways. None of us believed that that was going to be possible.
So what is the implication of that for our understanding of what we think of as the unity of consciousness?
Well, it surely shows that consciousness isn't unified in the sense that all the aspects which we sometimes lump under consciousness don't all have to be present at one time in the same subject. The Blindsight subject says it's like nothing to see, and that he's not conscious of vision. In some other sense, is conscious, because yes, he knows that he can guess correctly, and so he has access to that information. But I'll tell you another way in which this, I think, was really very important, at least in my own history of being involved with Blindsight. Later on, I studied a young woman who was probably a case of Blindsight, who had had cataract since the age of a very young girl, about 2 years. And her brain had grown up to the age of 20 without getting any patterned light coming into her eyes. She had come from Persia to have an operation in London to remove the cataracts and to restore sight, or so it was hoped. But during the intervening period, the tragedy was that apparently the visual cortex of her brain had degenerated. In fact, we might have guessed that would have been what had happened. So she, when I met her, didn't have any visual cortex, so she had functioning eyes. She said she was blind. She was deeply disappointed. She told me the whole operation had been a disaster and a tragedy for her. But I tried to persuade her that things mightn't be as bad as she thought they were. And so I rather, don't misunderstand this, but rather, as I had done when I was working with my pet monkey, I took this young woman by the hand and took her out for walks in the parks of London and so on, and pointed things out to her and tried to coax her vision back. And it turned out, yes, she did have some vision. She could see the colours of the flowers in the park. She could see a pigeon when it alighted on the grass in front of her. She could reach out and take a door handle when she approached it. But the remarkable thing was that she found this experience of vision pointless, meaningless. She had the new capacity, but it wasn't what she wanted. She wanted conscious vision. That's what she'd imagined all this time. She was a highly sophisticated and creative young woman. She'd been reading the poets about the nature of vision and the wonders which it delivers to sighted people. It wasn't there for her. And she didn't feel herself involved in her vision. And that, I think, gives us an extraordinary clue about what conscious vision is doing, which wouldn't be present without it. And to finish that story, this brave young woman solved the problem. She nearly didn't. She tried to kill herself a couple of times. She became very, very depressed. But then she solved the problem by taking up her white stick again, putting on her dark glasses, and going back to the life of being blind. The vision which she'd recovered, probably a kind of blind sight, was just not worth having. Now, if anything tells you about the importance of consciousness in our lives, I think that particular case history may do.